Welcome, everyone. I am Jack Powell. I'm a principal consultant within the mobility advisory team. Our topic of discussion today is software-defined vehicles and the next frontier of vehicle innovation. A little bit of background on me. I've been 4 years at Frost & Sullivan, 10 years in the automotive technology consulting world. So I work in infotainment, connected car, and the software-defined vehicle primarily, strategy work, market research, voice of customer work as well is mainly where I spend my time. And over the course of the next 30 or 40 minutes, we're going to be diving into three main questions, as well as presenting some trends on the current state of play in the industry. Those three questions are, how are organizational shifts impacting the rollout of SDVs? And then we'll look into the technical side of this question, specifically on zonal architectures and platform standardization. And then we're going to actually talk about something that is extremely current, the global uncertainty that's facing the automotive industry and affecting possibly the rollout of SDVs. So that's enough from me for the moment. I'm just going now to introduce our two panelists. Firstly, we have Praveen Narayanan. He's a vice president of consulting within our North American mobility practice. So Praveen, welcome. Maybe you could give us some context on your background, your career so far, and why this is an important topic to you.
Good afternoon to everybody. Good morning, wherever you're joining from, and thanks for taking the time to join us today. Very interesting topic, and a little bit about my background. As Jack mentioned, I head advisory for our team here in North America, the mobility automotive team. But my I'm running about 22 years in the automotive industry now. A large part of that within the advisory space, and also time in the industry for companies like TomTom and ChargePoint. Why SDVs are very interesting because, again, I think the term has been going around for a while now, but I think finally rational plans are getting into place, right? Like what's achievable. You're seeing things like, for example, OEMs licensing IP from the new age players and all of that. So, and also there is this growing feeling amidst a certain set of OEMs also is there too much content going in the car? Is there too much content that is being pushed into consumers, right? And for where is the ROI coming from and all of that? So this kind of like fine line balance that has to be walked to basically get that innovation in, get that sort of like software first mentality. But at the same time, also understand your customers, right? Like a Toyota needs to understand the average age of their customers, and Mercedes needs to do that. And at the same time, balance out these features and unlock what SDVs can do. SDVs is not just a point of sale concept. SDVs is a life cycle concept, right? And that's the fundamental difference in the way in the advantages it brings. And that's, to me, I've been part of during my time in the industry. I've been part of some very early on SDV roadmaps, SDV thinking at certain very large OEMs. So that makes this extra special for me because I've seen it in the thick of things in terms of how they're thinking through this, how they think they can execute on this, and so on. So yeah, that makes it very interesting. So happy to be here. Over to you, Jack.
Yeah, thank you, Praveen, for your background there. I'm looking forward to diving into it more with you. Our second panelist today is Jack Dunkley. He's a consultant within our European mobility advisory practice. So Jack, can you likewise give the audience some insight into your background, your expertise, and your current focuses as they relate to the SDV?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much, Jack. So I've been in the industry for 6 years now, whether that be in a market research or growth advisory consultancy. I've been at Frost & Sullivan for nearly 2 years now, participating in the areas of software-defined vehicle, more specifically in the realms of E&E architectures and regions such as ADAS as well. So they're kind of my key focuses. I cross over into the likes of connectivity as they all kind of relate together. And I think, you know, the key kind of areas at the moment that pique my interest is computing within the architecture. So that shift to perhaps zonal architectures that we're seeing, and centralized architectures that we're also seeing. Also, the kind of the shifting framework for how these organizations are having to organize themselves, really. We're seeing some cases where perhaps it's not working. We're seeing cases where it is working. And I think it's good to bring that to the front on, how we think the next frontier of vehicle innovation is being organized within these companies. And finally, my other key point, I think, is how are OEMs going to monetize this innovation, whether that be through subscriptions, data monetization. That is also a point of interest for me, and a point I think we're going to discuss very well today in this call.
Yeah. And Jack, you mentioned the dirty word, that monetization, but it's without monetization, that there is nothing. There's no money for investments, reinvestments. It's an interesting topic that's been very trendy in the last few years. So sure we'll touch upon that later in this discussion. But we're going to set the scene. We're going to set the scene a little bit before we dive into a bit of a roundtable between the three of us. I'm going to cover what we see at a macro level quickly, and then we're going to pass over to Praveen and Jack on their areas of focus, and then we'll dive into those three questions. So for us, I think it's important to show what we see as the future of mobility towards 2040 and beyond. And I think that's characterized by 5 main trends. EVs, obviously. I mean, EVs, we predict that they're going to surpass internal combustion engines by the mid-2030s. It's been a painful transition so far, but hopefully we're going to see ramp up from the likes of new solid-state batteries, cost drops, charging infrastructure growth. So the direction has not been linear, but it has been in one direction, and we expect that to continue. The area that we're going to focus mostly on today is connected and software-driven vehicles. So that transition is happening now. Software is growing in importance. We're updating as a hygiene and convenience prerequisite, I suppose, and then we're upgrading features, or we're giving consumers the option to upgrade. And that, for the OEMs, they hope is going to bring additional revenue from selling features on demand over the air. So that's where we're going to focus most of our time. But to give you the wider context, we're going to go into these 3 things that we see towards 2040. Third one is autonomous driving. We know that level 5 is distant. Level 2 and 2+ is where adoption is rising today in kind of Western markets and beyond. Level 4 we see in select corridors, like on the West Coast in San Francisco, but that is not happening quickly across the world due to regulations. But we have our eye on that as well, and it all feeds in to what we'll be talking about today. Multimodality, so really you could call it mobility as a service. Now that really has experienced slower than expected growth. I think it was a very trendy topic a few years ago. Lots of OEM divestments by this point, selling off different arms to different other companies to have a go at this. It hasn't turned out to be profitable really in any way yet. We've seen many startups come and go. But I think in the long term, we need to work this out if we're going to have that kind of holistic approach to future mobility. And then finally, to leave you with a really futuristic one, but it is happening slowly, transcendal mobility. So urban air mobility is what I mean by this. Air taxis, drones. We expect that this could become viable in the next 10 years or so. There are interesting startups that are around, like Joby and Lilium, and we've seen some startups come and go, but we'd expect that. So it's not a case of who's first in this race, it's who can really last and who can bring some new value propositions. So that's really the major trends we see at a very high level. But let's talk about what's happening right now. I think we've got to look at this conversation today through a macroeconomic lens. 8 trends that we see. Certainly, there's added complexity from the Trump administration. High import costs, supply chain friction, deregulation, diluted environmental standards. So it's a unpredictable policy environment. And in fact, just before we came on air this afternoon, I'm in the UK, but in the morning across North America, we've heard Mercedes-Benz be added to the list of automakers alongside Stellantis and Volvo Cars in the last 24 hours, who said, look, we're suspending earnings guidance amid this uncertainty. So it's not just the tariffs that are being seen. There are other factors, but certainly that is one that is creating great complexity. Inflation and interest rates. I suppose inflation in the last few years has cooled, but geopolitical shocks can have an effect on that and can kind of reignite it. But overall, I'd say across the Western world, reduced consumer confidence, reduced business confidence because of this. It's delaying vehicle purchases, vehicle refreshes. It's all being brought into the wider environment, and also this is in the context of what's going on across the world with geopolitical volatility, raging wars, instabilities. That's disrupting the energy supply and spikes in commodity costs. So yeah, you could be forgiven for thinking that this is a pretty difficult environment to be selling vehicles in, and I would agree with that. I promise I'm going to get to some positive news in a minute. If you just bear with me, we're going to talk about some of the technology trends. Certainly, with this global uncertainty, companies are looking at restructuring their supply chains. So I think 2020, we had uncertainty due to the semiconductor shortage. We saw a decent recovery in 2024, but 25 has really brought new challenges with it. The last three that I'll focus on are really to do with technology. So we point to the impact that Elon Musk is having, not necessarily within government and his position there, but just the fingers that he's got in different technology pies, if you like, that really touch upon our industries. It could be AI, it could be space, energy, broadband, that sort of thing. It's going to have an impact across the automotive and transportation space. So that's an outsized impact. Then we're seeing breakthroughs in hyperconnectivity, quantum computing, and speeding up connectivity, and this will have an effect on connected car services. So how can this be leveraged? And that feeds into our topic for today. Software-defined vehicles. They've really now become a strategic priority of the OEM boardroom. I don't think there's any automaker who has not been talking about this. Cars that are updatable through the life cycle, configurable, and in a consumer's mind, the easiest way for them to understand it is a smartphone model. So that's what we're going to dive into a little bit in the next few slides. I'm going to pass over to my colleague Jack, and then we'll go to Praveen, and then we'll start with our questions.
Thank you very much, Jack. So what are we seeing within this software-defined vehicle space today? Well, I spoke that I'm very interested in the architecture side of things, and we're seeing new innovations within the space, especially when it comes to the likes of zonal architectures and chiplets and chipsets in general. So just as an example, the Shanghai Auto Show was last week, and we saw Intel release a SoC with a chiplet architecture. So these modular chipsets that we're seeing are rapidly evolving the architecture landscape. We're seeing the likes of VW adopting Rivian zonal architecture. So we're seeing these architectures being shared between you would assume our competitors within the industry. Next, we're also seeing that fabled word AI. It's still around, and it's going to be around for a very long time. But these AI cockpits, these AI assistants, they're going to be able to reason, to do tasks that the consumer would typically be doing within the vehicle. They're able to essentially be that agent that the consumer needs within the vehicle to complete tasks, progressing on from simply being able to answer questions. We're seeing the expansion of in-vehicle app stores and gaming. I spoke on the revenue streams, that word monetization. OEMs are realizing that vehicles can have console level gaming within them, and they're able to essentially monetize this to provide entertainment to the consumer when perhaps they're charging their electric vehicle. Another key topic that I'm sure everyone is aware of is China, and obviously their shift over to the European markets. And this is also the case within the realm of software-defined vehicles. So we're seeing software stacks that typically would only be in China being moved over to Europe. A good example of this is ECARX, an SDV platform provider being used within European vehicles. They made a recent announcement where they partnered with HERE, for example, for global navigation SDK. So these Chinese companies that would typically only be in China are moving over to Europe and taking a market share here. And finally, this is important for the consumer, cybersecurity and regulatory compliance. So the R155 and R156 are very important for maintaining the consumer's data is safe, especially when it comes to over-the-air updating. OEMs need to make sure they're following these rules, to the final full stop. It's got to be done, and this is pushing this continuous hardening of the spend. Next slide, please, Jack. So what are we seeing through our work here at Frost & Sullivan? Well, first of all, we're seeing that the SDV is much wider than simply OEMs monetizing these opportunities. You might be thinking, well, isn't this just heated seat subscriptions? Well, no, it's full vehicle lifecycle cost cutting. So you have OTA fixes or bugs. You also have that removes the need for vehicles going to the dealership for warranty, for example. We also have items such as regulatory compliance, residual value boosting. All of these dwarf, pure add-on value that the OEMs are seeing from the software-defined vehicle. Next one, please, Jack. Yeah. So we see that this simply isn't a project that lasts a few years. It is a multi-decade business transformation shift. We've seen that perhaps EVs are slowing this down. That governments keep changing their minds on when the selling of internal combustion engine vehicles will be slowed down, and these are conversely slowing down this adoption of software-defined vehicles. It's creating this barrier. Items are getting delayed, platforms are getting delayed. And this is something that we're seeing, more common and more frequently now within the industry. New rules for working, sourcing, and partnering. We have the likes of legacy OEMs who are not necessarily structured or organized for the software-defined vehicle shift. And we also have suppliers within the industry that aren't necessarily ready for this as well. Tier ones may just have to pivot to become software integrators rather than full solution providers. We see the likes of chipset providers. They're now becoming the tier ones of the world. They're shipping these turnkey solutions to OEMs. We have Volvo, for example, utilizing NVIDIA chips straight from NVIDIA rather than going through a tier one supplier. The OEMs are essentially jumping over the typical tier one and going straight to these chipset providers for these solutions. And finally, features on demand. It was a few years ago now, we had the heated seat incident, as I like to call it. But OEMs are now realizing that consumers need to see and feel the value of these features on demand to essentially want them. Consumers hate, well, I like this term, but nickel and dining. Willingness plummets if a feature is perceived as already paid for. And that was the case with the heated seat example. It needs to provide additional benefit to consumer for them to warrant paying that additional cost through the subscription. So for us, there are kind of three approaches to recurring revenue. So features on demand. And one of those is updatability and upgradability through over-the-air updates. As I said before, OEMs are realizing that if a consumer thinks that they've already got the hardware at point of sale, they're not going to be interested in paying further down the line through an over-the-air update or a subscription for features related to that. They want a smartphone on wheels. They want to download and use features that provide extra benefit on top. So updatability is related to the convenience and hygiene of the consumer, and upgradability is about modifying and diversifying the product portfolio. We see a lot of, especially EVs these days, are all very similar in what they offer. And these over-the-air updates and features on demand allow the OEM to diversify their portfolio and stand out. Next, we have that word again that Jack mentioned, monetization or data utilization. So how do OEMs use this data that they gather from consumers using their vehicles? And what use cases do they see the most benefit? And we see a few different ones today. For example, fleet management, especially with new vehicles as well. We see EV related services and insurance. So consumers and businesses are interested in these features, but it's also about balancing that innovation with pragmatism. So it's looking out for perhaps a new use case further down the line, or listening to the consumer and seeing where that value is, most well received. And finally, we have the consumer side of things, which is personalization and their user experience. OEMs need to redefine that user experience to create that emotional connection with the consumer. Once a consumer becomes, emotionally connected to the vehicle, then they create that loyalty with the brand. And this can be done through items such as in-car gaming, streaming, creating a place that the consumer wants to be in. And another thing they can do is personalize that vehicle to be for them, essentially. You can personalize the HMI to react to what they like, what radio station they like to listen to, where they navigate on a day-to-day basis. It feels like a vehicle that they have set up themselves, and that creates a lasting relationship between the consumer and the OEM. And this is a big power play for OEMs in terms of their brand power, creating a UX that consumers not only love but want to use.
Thank you, Jack. Very, very interesting insights there. I think just before we move to Praveen, I've just seen a question come in from Laura. Have you seen any good examples of features on demand done well? Maybe I'll just give my perspective. I think this is still a very test and try strategy. I think OEMs are dipping their toe. There's kind of no gold standard, and there are different approaches that we've seen. So if you look at BMW and Mercedes-Benz, they've gone with quite a wide, maybe 20, 30 plus features that they can enable over the air in a feature on demand way. If you look at an OEM like Volvo, it's a very pared down feature set. I think some performance related features around increasing the acceleration of the vehicle is one of them. So there is no kind of perfect way. I think we're still seeing this come to market. That's my perspective. Maybe Praveen, this would be a nice way for you to kind of enter the conversation What have you seen from your side, and maybe can you link it into the slides that you'll be discussing right now, actually?
Sure. I think, see, this whole notion of feature on demand is very interesting because, again, it's kind of like many OEMs refer to go back to like Tesla. Hey, look, Tesla does it really well. If you actually look at Tesla, they don't have a very wide feature on demand kind of thing, right? Like you basically FSD is what makes up their, if you want to call it, FOD strategy, right? And see, this is where this whole notion of monetizing the SDV kind of comes in, right? Of course, you've got mass market OEMs like Kia, for example, in the US. They have this whole, I think they started it with the EV9, that's their 3-row electric SUV. They launched a sort of like an FOD effort where you can get their level 2 ADAS system, you can get a lot of interior ambient features and all of that. And it's interesting. And this is where you also have to tie a little bit of consumer behavior. As if having worked for a navigation company, one of the things that we always, if you see, most consumers revert to, except for Tesla users, is they plug in their phone and they just start using CarPlay or Android Auto, and it's just familiar realm from them. However good your in-car system is, right? Now, how do you, if you're an OEM, why do you want to spend X amount of dollars licensing that system and putting a very comprehensive system with the UX and all of that, versus thinking of a new business model? Okay, I have the system. I'll enable certain features of the system if you want it. I don't know, you're going for a long trip. There may be places where your cellular network might be dead, so you need a backup system. So yes, my system could be that. So you pay me for that, I don't know, for a 1 week usage. So there will be that very pockets of nuanced use cases where this will work, right? Maybe something like an FSD level 2 system might work, right? But uniformly looking at FOD as the sort of like a big revenue puller or demonetization place, unfortunately, I don't think the market is giving us any good info today to go to that conclusion, right? And that kind of segues nicely into what I want to talk about, which is I'm more interested in how OEMs are executing this. What is specifically coming out that's interesting, right? And the first instance to that is, how do you segment these SDV efforts? I know there is an industry-wide effort going on to to create a segmentation for SDVs. I think it's a 5-pronged segmentation. But the way we see it is you go from a power-hungry architecture that's on the leftmost side, to, I think Jack Dunkley had shown that as well, which is the power surplus kind of architecture, which is towards the right, right? Now, what is the difference? You move from a system where OEMs tend to largely write requirements, which means they are not actively involved in this as an integrator. They are more like, it's, if you imagine a picture, it's like if you imagine a tree-like structure. OEMs sit at the top, they write these requirements, and then they are sourcing these infotainment tier 1, ADAS tier 1, body electronics tier 1, and so on and so forth. And each of these tier 1s are the ones who are actually bringing their IP, right? Of course, OEMs also source the hardware and all of that, but who is putting this together is the tier 1, right? The IP belongs to them. And that is also one reason why OTA in these previous generation systems is very tough, because the IP, the network is, the architecture is not open enough, and B, the IP is not, the stack doesn't belong or to the OEM per se, right? So they cannot control it. From there, you look at a partial sort of an effort. And again, we've seen this already, where several OEMs that move to this domain central architecture, which is pretty much now major OEMs are in this kind of bucket, where you've got an infotainment domain, you've got an ADAS domain, and so on. Now you've got almost like a digital cockpit domain and all that. You've got some of these domains with Ethernet backbones, some of these domains that are first generation connected to the cloud. And this is where limited OTA is possible, and it's higher compared to the first earlier effort. And you've already seen it, like in cockpit and all of that. BMWs or the Mercedes of the world, even before the newer systems, they've been doing that, not just Teslas and the likes. So that's what we call partial. And that is where most of the industry is today, right? From there, you go to what you call, if you call this Gen 2 or a full SDV, this is where the entire sort of like, let's say, power surplus, future-proof hardware, and everything comes in. Like you're essentially creating an architecture where the software update can reach every single subsystem in the car. And that's basically what the central compute does, right? And that is enabled through a cloud native architecture. Again, this is where you hear technical terms like service oriented architectures, where containerization becomes the key. You're breaking your system application into smaller interoperable kind of services and putting them in these containers, and your ability to then update that becomes um, easier, right? And the biggest trick of them all is agile software development. You look at Tesla, right? Again, I'm a Tesla owner. I just saw today that there's a spring update coming up. It's V something something dot 14 or something. It almost reads like your smartphone update or any personal computing software update, right? And that is the thing. And how are they achieving it is they have a very agile software development, tech stack development sort of like focus, where there is a team that does FSD, there's a team that does the infotainment cockpit related features. And then these software builds are continuously evolved, right? And that brings it to a certain maturity level. And the last point, which is interesting, of course, AI at the edge and all of that is very interesting, because that once you start collecting data, once you start doing the cloud at the edge, you now see use cases, for example, like UBI or insurtech, where it can happen at the edge. You don't need to transfer all the data to the cloud and incur these cloud costs, right? And the pinnacle of that all, and this is the interesting part and also the biggest challenge, is now the OEMs are firmly sitting in a triangle. If you look at it as a triangle or a circle, now the OEMs are in there at the center as the system integrator, and they are basically the ones that are putting the system together, in many cases developing the code. In almost all the cases, they are validating, they are doing the verification, they're building, and they're beta testing, releasing, and updating it, right? And that is the vision. That is where Tesla's excelled really well. And that is where a lot of these, of course, a lot of the Chinese OEMs belong there. Rivian is fast going into that bucket. And that is where the legacy OEMs want to kind of move there, right? Next slide, please. And I just want to give one example, right? Of course, there are many numbers as to what sort of lead Tesla has compared to. And again, this lead is not just because of the architecture. The lead is because of a number of things. It's because of the architecture. It's because of their tech stack maturity. But most importantly, of course, they didn't have legacy platforms when they started, unlike your legacy OEMs. But still, if you take a Model S or an X, which were their so-called premium models, higher value models, Tesla actually took the opposite approach. For those models, they went with the domain central architecture, which still, I think, persists. But when they introduced the Model 3, they already leapfrogged. This is 2018 or something, or 17, somewhere in that time frame. They're already they had a vision to move into this sort of like zonal architecture, have these Ethernet backbone gateways, and have these, let's say, have a way. For example, Tesla sort of like consolidates the ADAS and their infotainment system in that CCM module in the front, right? Now, you think if this is supported by an open Ethernet sort of a gateway, one of the things this is amazing at is that camera data, the front camera data, now can be used by several systems, right? That signal is available to several other systems. For example, that adaptive high beam can use that system. Several others that leverage that camera data to make decisions. And if you own a Tesla and if you've seen it, you see that in action, right? And they've improved that architecture further in Model Y, for example, when they introduced it to just 3 zones, right? So they're constantly sort of like thinking of course, from a cost saving perspective, from a let's say pure play. How can software be the leader in all of this? How can AI sort of like, let's say, play a big role, right, into all of this? And it's very clear that they have the most robust OTA strategy today, right? Like, and when I say robust, there isn't a single subsystem inside the vehicle that they can't control or they can't update or they can't even they can't improve amongst let's say through an OTA, right? And if you look at the Tesla does like spring releases, summer releases, winter releases, these are all major releases, and then you've got the minor releases. It will basically mirror that of a smartphone, right? So that's the lead. If you think of an example, that's the lead that they have from that thinking perspective. And the team behind all of this is still a very lean team. You're not talking thousands of engineers doing all of this, right? It's much, much less, right? Next slide, please.
Just before we go any further, Praveen, we have had a question
Sure.
come in from Marcus. And it's an interesting one. Basically, if we're moving to a future where we're future-proofing the electrical architecture and we're rolling out over-the-air updates, what kind of effect is it going to have on OEM sales, do you think? Since the vehicles that the customers have are going to be up to date by definition.
No, see, it's a fantastic question and something that you have to grapple as an OEM, right? Or as anybody involved in that ecosystem. Let me give you an example. The average age of a vehicle in the US right now is approaching 13 years. So customers are holding on to their cars much longer. Now, this is prompting several OEMs to think about to tap into that sort of like, let's say, older vehicles. What kind of upgrades can I do, right? What kind of upgrades? What kind of, let's say, is there a business in that, right? So I think there is a balance that you have to strike between, um, uh, of course, we are saying future-proof hardware, but at a certain point that hardware will tap out, right? We've seen the example with Tesla. Elon Musk kept saying that hardware 3 will work for the newer version of FSD, and he kept saying that. Now it's out in the open that no, those customers have to be now upgraded to the newer hardware 4 of the FSD. So what does that mean? That means that your hardware juice will run out at some point, right? And I don't know if it's at the 4-year mark, 5-year mark, 6-year mark, or whatever, but that's still better than what it is today. Today, as a legacy OEM, your transaction with that customer is 3 years long or 4 years long or whatever, but it's largely 3 years till that lease or till that first ownership is there. And it's mostly point of sale. You're selling them an option and so on. And after that, you don't know who that customer is. You don't know who owns that car. There's no way for you to make any money, right, in that space. It basically becomes either a dealer play or an aftermarket play, right? Now that problem gets solved with these OTAs and all of that, where you still have a way to tap into that with the right architecture, right system that is going into production today. You have an ability, so-called ability to reach out to that customer for 10 years, right? Of course, Teslas and the Rivians of the world have the added advantage because they are D2C, right? They're direct to consumer. They own that consumer from day one, right? So I think that's the balance we are talking about here, right? And this SDV could even give you that second or third user business that never existed at an OEM, right? So again, I'm not saying whether that monetization is going to be huge or whatever, but there is an opportunity to still update that car, to still I drive a 2020 Tesla and I still get, let's say, updates and all of that. That's available in the most recent Tesla, right? So I'm not missing out on any charging feature or any infotainment feature and so on, right? So I think that's where the balance has to be, right?
Yeah. I think it's interesting, and I like the way that you called it balance. I think that's the right phrase. I think at the end of the day, we're in the automotive industry and we're dealing with assets that are safety critical, and there can be no planned obsolescence like we have in the smartphone industry, where, let's face it, our handsets do degrade over time. I don't know if that's planned or not, but that can certainly not happen in a car. So we'll just move to the last slide. I see your question, Laura, as well. I think this is going to partially answer it, but I'll ask Praveen if we don't get to that.
Definitely. So where does that now, having looked at what we looked at, where does that leave the so-called legacy OEMs who are also fast thinking, fast catching up, right? You've got to think of this in like a few ways. To move to an SDV, you need a future-proof compute, right? Power surplus, as you call it. You need a cloud-native architecture. You need a robust tech stack and a strategy for that software stack development, um, which again, and the role that you're going to play as an OEM within that, and a robust OTA strategy, which is your ability to update, upgrade, all of that, right? And how does this all come together in terms of a cohesive strategy? Now, if you look at it that way, most OEMs are moving in that direction, including legacy. Of course, the pace at which they are moving and their ambitions are different, right? Now, if you take, for example, somebody like Hyundai, again, that's the most recent example, and I use that example. They announced the Plios brand, right? The Plios is nothing but their software brand. That is their underpinning software SDV strategy, and that is going to take shape in model year 2026, right? And that is a completely new user interface, a cockpit platform, and a system that looks like looks very much like a Tesla approach. And of course, they are bringing together a lot of ecosystem partners, Samsung and so on. And Google, they're going to build their system on Android operating system, and they're building that cockpit OS themselves. So, and they are trying to again take this in-house. They acquired a few companies like let's say 42 Dot was an internal subsidiary and all of that, and they're all going to work together to deliver this Hyundai mission. Now, is Hyundai going to be the first to market? No, but I don't think that's the race here. The race here is more, I need to flush out, I need to see what other OEMs are doing, learn from their mistakes and all of that, and then find a nice balance in terms of my approach, right? You've got BMW and Mercedes who are already leading, right? Like BMW, I think even took their new cluster to the Shanghai Auto Show. That's their new the multi-energy platform, as well as their underpinning new zonal architecture and their let's say new system, right? That's building up on the OS 9 and so on. Mercedes continues to evolve the MB.OS and the MB.UX largely with an in-house effort. Uh, so I think the transition is happening. And the other interesting part is there are three steps here, right? First, you consolidate your vehicle platforms, and that we are seeing from most OEMs. Stellantis, for example, has now 4 platforms, right? Volkswagen has 4, including one dedicated for China, right? So once you consolidate a multi-energy vehicle platform, then you design your E&E architecture underneath. And that, again, we are seeing most OEMs move or announce a move towards zonal architecture, as only a few like GM, where it's not very clear what their next generation architecture is going to be. And then the third one is, let's say, how are you going to structure your software development on top with the software first kind of mentality? And that is where you look at Stellantis, they have SWX, that's internal, and so on, right? There's a lot of internal effort, or there's very close partnerships there, right? And then, of course, you can't not talk about the Chinese, because they bring scale to this entire equation, right? Because again, that's largely an in-house effort. If you look at BYD, a lot of this is consolidated in their intelligent driving business unit, as they are called. And I think that has 3,000 plus people working on God's Eye, which is a beautiful name for a ADAS AD system, and then their whole cockpit features. And they're bringing in a number of interesting ecosystem players, right? So I think the whole notion here is OEMs realize that they have to own this, and that is where I think one of the first things we'll discuss in our questions will come up on the next slide, right? Back to you, Jack.
Yeah, thank you, Praveen. I think this is a tremendous example of the depth that we go to both in our reports and in our advisory engagements. So what you're seeing today is 3 members of the advisory team, but behind us we have reports and analysts who are compiling this. So Laura, I think Praveen has gone some way to answering your question. Hopefully in the next segment we will nail it. If not, then please connect with us offline. I see that we only have around 10 minutes left, so this is going to be a bit of a quick fire round, Praveen and Jack. We'll go to the first question. And yeah, I'll come to you, Praveen, because I think your recent projects and engagements have taught you some interesting lessons here. What organizational shifts do you see as being critical, or maybe even most difficult for OEMs to implement when they're pursuing the software-defined vehicle?
See, for legacy OEMs, the entire mindset itself is challenging. See, they are good at making cars. They are good at making engines or batteries or motors and drivetrains and all of that, right? Now, suddenly, you have to put this up proposition of a software first mentality. That it's a huge transformational shift, right? And this is where, again, of course, traditional OEMs have been developing software, but that has largely been this waterfall. You develop it for 2 years. The overall development cycle is 4 years, and as a user, you and I have to wait for a new car every 4 years to enjoy anything new, right? But that's the anti-thinking that the new digital EV OEMs have brought to the table, which is no. You start with the thinking as any sort of, like, let's say, smartphone or computing player, which is separate the stack from the vehicle, right? You have a vehicle. Of course, they also did the right thing, that they consolidated their vehicle platforms and the number of models and trims. And the traditional OEMs also battle this whole thing of, I need to have, if it's a cockpit system, I need to have a low-end variant, a mid-end variant, a high-end variant, because I've got 8 variants, 8 trim levels of a model. It's extremely complicated. But what is happening is, of course, the challenge is you've got to move to these new type of cloud native architecture, for example. That means hyperscalers, your AWS or your Microsoft, now become your very important partner, because they bring a lot to the table. In fact, what Amazon's doing with AWS is doing with Stellantis is very interesting. They've built a virtual workbench. They've built virtual cockpits, which speeds up you don't need to wait for a head unit. You don't need to wait for a physical unit to do your testing. You develop your code, you are able to test it, and multiple teams globally can collaborate on that, right? And then comes the whole agile sort of like DevOps sort of like thinking, which is, I need to ship software faster, right? And that means I need to own this, and that means I need to have a lot of people, let's say, shore up my development, right? Like, again, we've seen slightly unsuccessful examples here, like Volkswagen Cariad and other challenging examples. But you've also seen some interesting lean examples, and that segues into my third point, which is many OEMs like BMW with Tata Technologies and all of that are examples of how they tap into these GCCs, how they tap into global partners, these system integrators as they are called, and tap into them, and also leverage global competency centers. Have a team in Romania, have a team in multiple parts of India where software talent is abundant. I think that's the strategy that most of these, let's say, cumulatively are going to or have to go to. And of course, let's understand that this is it's not going to be done next year. I think Jack D mentioned that very clearly. It's a multi-decade transformational shift, and that has to sink in, because you now are forced to think like a software first organization, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think some great points there, some great takeaways as well. The quote that I like, and he's very good for sound bites, is the Ford CEO, Jim Farley. I think on a podcast he said, look, at the moment, or the legacy that we have, we've had 150 different companies developing software for us, and they're all speaking different languages. Now, how do you be agile in an environment like that? So I think reducing the complexity as well is one of the things that they're trying to do, and one of the points Praveen was making there. So we'll go to the next question. Jack, maybe if you keep your answer fairly short, but I think it's an important topic. What do you see in terms of how ready the industry as a whole is to embrace new zonal architectures that we're talking about on slides like this? What kind of reality do we see today?
Yeah, thank you, Jack. I mean, I think it's a bit of a yes and a no answer, to be honest with you. I think you have a clear divide between certain OEMs. You have the OEMs that have come straight from straight to these modern architectures, such as the likes of Tesla. That's always the common example there. But you also have these legacy OEMs that have multiple parallel architectures running at the same time. They have vehicles that are perhaps a few years old running on older architectures. They have vehicles that are brand new, that are running on different architectures, and that creates issues within the organization. And we've seen how, I think Praveen touched on it quite a lot on the previous question as well, how these organizations are having to shift massively, especially in terms of the talent gap. That's one of my key points there. Traditional mechanical engineers that they have within these companies that would typically work on hardware, they're having to be retrained to focus on software within these legacy OEMs, and that's taking a lot of time, a lot of money. I know myself, if I go on LinkedIn, for example, every other job within automotive is to do with some form of software, and we're seeing that shift within the industry. And there is that uncertainty for those legacy OEMs. We've seen that creating these individual companies that focus purely on the software doesn't necessarily always work. And these OEMs are having to perhaps partner, for example, the sake of Volkswagen, that they partnered with these newer companies that have done it straight out the box. And that is a solution to embrace the zonal architectures of the future. Finally, just to keep this as short as possible, I think it's worth mentioning again how the shifting supply within the industry is playing a big factor. We have the likes of legacy OEMs now no longer going with your typical tier ones. They're either creating their own dedicated fabrication for semiconductors. Take GM, for example, with Global Foundries. We also have traditional OEMs partnering directly with semiconductor providers. You have the likes of Stellantis partnering with Infineon, Ford with NXP. Tier threes are essentially skipping over the tier one gatekeepers for these gateway and zonal layers. And this is, creating quite a competitive market when it comes to zonal architectures. And having that kind of platform standardization at scale is difficult when you have all of these competing parties trying to essentially do the same thing. There's a lot of shifting going on. There's a lot of movement. People and companies aren't necessarily sure what to do, how to implement it. So again, I think the background of this slide is quite apparent. It's a big question mark. That's how I would describe it. And just to kind of finish it up, legacy hurdles, shifting supply lines, and scarce talents. I like to refer to them as kind of the three legs of the software-defined vehicle stool. If you kick out any of those three legs, the stool will fall over. So these OEMs need to make sure that those three legs of their stool are all in place. Otherwise, it will fall. That is how I would describe it.
It's a good analogy, Jack. I've not heard it described that way, but I know that you're in the weeds of this on a day-to-day basis, profiling and benchmarking these architectures. So yeah, great to hear your view. So we'll close with a final question. I'm going to direct it to Praveen. I suppose it's the elephant in the boardroom, if you like. Jack and I were a supplier last week, and hearing how they're reacting to the global uncertainty sounds a little bit terrifying. How do you read this in respect of what we're trying to achieve with the SDV, Praveen?
For OEMs that are again, let's look at this in a balanced way. Yes, there is the tariff uncertainty, but of course there's some news yesterday from the administration here that as long as there's 85% let's say parts local, I think something to do with the way the USMCA was negotiated, there could be some tariff relief that's already announced, right? But what all of this does is, of course, the pressure on China, and let's, for example, look at it like most chips are not made here, right? Most chips are not made in Europe. Most chips are made where, like outside of into the Asian region, right? So that's going to put a certain complication in terms of sourcing that particular chip or the price of that chip or whatever, right? What it is, see, it's going to do a couple of things. It's going to, of course, I see SDV development as more a true sort of like independent development, but still OEMs need these new legacy OEMs need a certain test vehicle to actually launch that, right? Now, those vehicles, depending on how they are impacted, could move the goalpost of this SDV, the introduction, the scaling up of this whole thing, right? But having said that, somebody like Hyundai is still very aggressive, right? They're still very aggressive in their intent to launch the Plios Connect and all of that. And they are not very insulated from all these, the geopolitical pressures or the supply chain scrutiny and all of that, right? So I think, of course, um, uh, shoring back to, for example, in the US or something, is again, this is not local sourcing is not going to happen overnight, right? Forming local supply chains is not going to happen overnight. This is a 5-year, 6-year process, right? So this is going to push a lot more um, ingrained development. But if you look at the core of the SDV development, like the software and all of that, right? The software development, how that is, let's say, teams are coming together, that's largely already what I would call localized, right? Localized with, of course, support of international teams. So to me, I don't think the impact is going to be, yes, there are going to be impacts on vehicle launches. I think, for example, BMW announced to their dealers here in the US that they are going to push their May timeframe for some of the new EVs indefinitely, right? So that sort of push is going to happen. That sort of, let's say, model launches, platform delays of the EVs, because a lot of times these these legacy OEMs tie their SDV launch with the new sort of like BEV launch, BEV platform launch, right?
Yes.
And that is going to get probably delayed and pushed, right? But I still see, because in the long run, if you look at what the investment into SDVs is going to bring the OEMs, it's it's going to bring a lot of savings. It's going to bring a lot of, let's say, efficiency into the whole development process and all of that, right? So I think it is going to be a moving goalpost for a little while, and I think it'll stabilize after that.
Yeah. Thank you, Praveen. I think that's a great way to close. Yeah, I think the last thing to say is thank you very much for your attendance. It's been a very lively debate that we've had between us. I hope it's been useful, and please reach out if you have any questions. We'll be very happy to speak to you on a one-to-one basis. So enjoy the rest of your day, and please attend another webinar with us soon. Thank you.